All right, let me see this. I believe we're live here.
Okay, yeah, it says live, yeah.
I'll believe it when I see it. Hold on, I'm just checking on my YouTube to see if that's going.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm a big time professional, so get used to it. Oops. Plus, it takes a couple minutes for people to kind of, just show up.
Yeah, fair enough.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't tell.
I mean, it says it's live on my
Here we go.
screen here.
Yeah, I was just looking over here at the view on YouTube. I apologize, everybody else, because I'm not a professional interviewer. Okay, yeah, we're live. We're going. I can see it now.
Excellent. Very good.
Okay. All right. So let us begin then. Now, the whole reason I'm doing this is because when I began this comic book, William of Newbury, it takes place during the 12th century with a very real history that I was intertwining into my made-up story. Most of you on the web who are viewing this would have been familiar with William of Newbury. I don't have my comic in front of me. I wish I did. Which is an anthropomorphic retelling of many of. Hey, there we go. An anthropomorphic retelling of many of the actual stories that a 12th century monk named William of Newbury recorded alongside the actual histories, or to them it was all the same thing. The spiritual stuff was right next to the actual kings and queens fighting over the rule of the country, and other sort of mundane histories that he recorded. And right along next to all this crazy stuff, he was recording stuffs about like the dead coming back to life, demons and revenants and such. So when I first read these stories, which began with this thing called the Green Children, which was a pretty famous account of these like physically green children that showed up, I was always fascinated by these stories. And as I did research on that story, I had discovered who William of Newbury was. And William of Newbury wrote this account and several other accounts, all of which the stories in William of Newbury are all based on his stories. So there's a story that takes place in Berwick, and it's based on actual events that he wrote down. But then, of course, I created my own sort of fantasy version. So in doing all this research for specifically a 12th century history, I'm doing all the research that I can, and I come across this Facebook page, and this Facebook page is called Medieval England, simply put. Lots of great resources there. I immediately kind of searched through the page looking for William of Newbury's stories, and there were a couple of articles that people had written. And then I started just getting more and more addicted to the page, because you'd also have people like Leo, who our guest is, who is just kind of not only posting articles but and histories, but they're right there. So they're doing like walks through the countryside, and here's this building from such and such time period with a little bit of story behind it. So I reached out to, once I kind of figured out who Leo was, that he was a student in this, that I reached out to him and started asking questions, and he's been a great help. So very quickly, Leo, you can fill this out a lot more. I want to say that you are a PhD student at the Medieval Studies of Royal Holloway at the University of London.
That's right.
You have sent me really hard to read histories that were like the actual writings at the time period, like some great scholarly stuff to study, and it's all been a huge help. I also have a book out right now. It's an Assassin's Creed tie-in that took place in ancient Ethiopia, and you knew a little bit about that, and you sent me some information about that as well. Leo has a thanks in the book. So without further ado of my own ramblings here, Leo, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing right now, and we'll start there.
Okay, well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on your little channel here. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for sending me your William of Newbury graphic novels or comics. They're really good. I really enjoyed reading those. And I've always liked Redwall, actually, and Duncton Wood and Watership Down and Animals of Farthing Wood. And I think you mentioned the Rats of Nim in at the end of yours book as well. So all of these sorts of anthropomorphic stories interest me very much, and I am an animal lover, actually, so that's part of it, I think. So I enjoy it that way, and obviously the fact that it's medieval themed is even even better, really. It reminds me a little bit of the Robin Hood by Disney, that
For sure.
sort of storytelling, and that's actually very on the mark with sort of medieval themed things, because obviously they're often having little animals in their margins of their manuscripts, little illuminated manuscript drawings of animals having little adventures, not necessarily related to the text, but sort of sometimes related, sometimes to decorate sort of little foxes or jousting snails or something like that. So it's all very relevant for sort of a medieval themed story, I think. So that's really good. So in terms of myself, so I originally am from a science background, actually, and I sort of decided to sort of pursue more medieval studies themed things in a serious way in about 2015, and then I registered with Royal Holloway in about 2017. I think I founded that Medieval England group in 2016, so it's a while ago now. And then so since then I've basically been working on a dissertation, which is the title, if you're interested. If you're interested in the title, or...
Yes, please.
Okay. So it's the interest shown by the dioceses of Winchester and Chichester of the Kingdom of England in the support of the Holy Land, Byzantium, and the Crusades during the late medieval period. So I'm particularly interested in sort of the interface, if you like, between medieval England and the Holy Land and the Byzantine Empire in the later Middle Ages, and specifically how much the bishops of Winchester and Chichester were involved in providing aid for Eastern Christians, whether they were Latins or Greeks, of the late medieval period. But that also involves, obviously, a good understanding, not just of medieval England and of Byzantium and of the Crusader states, but also of the sort of Islamic world as well. So the Mamluk Sultanate, for example, the Ottoman Empire, particularly relevant as well. So it's very interesting. Certainly keeps me very busy. But yeah, so that's what I do. And so obviously by the late Middle Ages, I sort of mean 13th, 14th, 15th century. So technically speaking, my specialism is slightly after the century that your graphic novel is set, which is obviously the 12th century. But nonetheless, I'm interested in the entire millennium of the Middle Ages, circa 500 to 1500. I'm interested in that whole time period in a sort of a more general sense, but I do focus in from a research perspective on the later Middle Ages, which is sort of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. But yeah, so that's pretty much sort of a summary. I don't want to drone on too much, but that's sort of a summary about what I'm doing at the moment. I am involved in some teaching as well on campus, but I'm approaching my final 6 months for my dissertation. So hence busy for me, yes.
So your long-term plan are you going to teach on a specific subject, or just this time period, or like, I don't know if you break down the time periods into regional or
well, in terms of breaking down the Middle Ages, so I mean, broadly speaking, there's the early Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1000. The high Middle Ages, roughly 1000 to sort of 1250 or 1300, and the late Middle Ages, 1250, 1300 to 1500, roughly. So obviously, a lot of I mean, 1000 years is a bit much for somebody to focus on at one time. So usually you would look at a particular part of the Middle Ages, time-wise, and also obviously location and personality-wise. Although depending on the scope of your work, you might well be looking at more than one kingdom or empire potentially, and the interrelations between them. No, I'm keen to continue on after I finish and my dissertation, and do further research and teaching on campus, essentially in academia. That's what I would like.
Yeah,
It'll be very competitive, so we'll have to see how it goes. But that's my interest, really. Yeah.
excellent. I was really excited when I found out about your interest in these different time periods because when I was first doing the William of Newbury
Oh yes.
research, my interest in medieval history has always been pretty generic. Like there's a sense of when you're looking at that time period and you're looking at it, especially through sort of pop culture eyes, and there's so much of that that's been sort of blended together.
Yes.
When you start to look at it and you start to find the specificity of things,
Yeah.
specific time periods start to become really, really interesting.
Mm.
And some assumptions that I had going into this deeper level of research was surprising. One of which was I had written in plague into my story, which thematically fit, but that time period, while there was some plagues that went around, it wasn't sort of
Oh right.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't like the plague as we thought of it later. So, whether it's the Black Plague or the bubonic plague, and which happened in different time periods.
Mm.
Um, but that kind of thing was interesting for me. Like
Yeah.
the closer in you get, the more specific these time periods are, and you find that there are people like they're very much in the later medieval period, or the earlier periods, because they are so. I mean, we're not even like 300 years old, right? And so like that's a chapter, a small chapter in much of
I
this history.
suppose, I mean, you say that, but I mean, obviously, the natives were there for a very long time,
Yeah.
and the Vikings arrived, I think, around the year 1000, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So but they only had relatively small settlements, I think, in Nova Scotia. They
Yeah.
did interact to some extent, I believe, with the locals. There's nothing much written about that, but there is
Yeah.
certainly there's archaeological evidence that the Vikings were settled in Nova Scotia and some small communities. Leif Erikson, I think, was perhaps involved.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then the later Portuguese and Spanish. But there are stone cities that some of the Native Americans built. I think there's one still in Colorado that you can visit, high
Yeah,
up in.
there's a lot of the mound builder stuff that came from South
Yeah,
America.
that's quite.
There's obviously a long history involved in the continent of the states, and it's sort of the same thing when you're looking at like Britain, and like the Anglo-Saxon period is very different than what happens after 1066.
Yes, big change in the administration of the nation, certainly, for England. I mean, certainly I think the Anglo-Norman rulers were more, they were harsher rulers, and they were very obsessed with sort of their bureaucracy and their administration. For example, the Doomsday Book is a good example of that. They literally catalogued what everyone was doing and what the financial output of their land was. I mean,
Yeah.
look at that now and think, wow, that's really impressive, and it is. But I think if you were living through that, it was a bit much, probably. So they were a bit. They were squeezing the population rather, and they really wanted absolute sort of control over the situation in the country, and all the land and things, which is relevant to your story, which is set during the Anarchy, because one of the reasons that dragged on so long was because everyone was, particularly the barons, were fed up with being too under the thumb of the Anglo-Norman rulers, and they realized that if people were squabbling, the rulers were squabbling, then they themselves could have a bit more say in what was going on at a local, regional level, and that was one of the reasons they allowed it to drag on, I think, and sort of the reaction almost to that excessive control that William the Conqueror and the Rufus and Henry Beauclerc had over the country. So that's an interesting point. I think the Anglo-Saxons generally were a bit more. I mean, obviously. I'm not saying they were perfect, but they were a bit more relaxed, I think, when it came to national governance, and that they had their witans, didn't they? And they sort of had a bit more, allowed a bit more involvement from others to help with the running of the country and so on. So I think it was a shock when the Normans took over, and obviously initially they had to militarily conquer the nation, so that would have definitely been a shock. And then once that had all died down, their system of governance would have also been quite a bit of a change for people. However, on the other hand, they were exceptional castle builders. They protected the country as well. There weren't any more invasions after the Normans, so they secured the borders. They built beautiful castles and cathedrals. They imported all this architecture. So all of these guys have their good and bad points, and it's certainly important to recognize that. It's a nuanced sort of situation. There isn't one person who's a goodie and one who's a baddie. They've all got their good and bad points, and
for sure. The moral ambiguity is pretty thick.
Yeah. But it's I mean, often historians of England do sort of separate 1066 as a very important date, which sort of divides those two worlds up, as it were, for England.
That was basically the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule for the most part, correct? Or was there any sort of leftover after that, or was it pretty much the end of it?
A lot of the Anglo-Saxon rulers and leaders were replaced by Anglo-Normans, or Normans, whatever you want to call them. I guess you can call them Anglo-Norman to sort of distinguish them from the people in Normandy still, perhaps. So the Normans did take a lot of positions over. There were some, what you might say, more collaborative Anglo-Saxons in smaller numbers who did manage to sort of hold on to office. And obviously there were people we're talking about the elite people here. Obviously the general population of the country stayed pretty much the same. So the average man or woman on the street is still an Anglo-Saxon, really, just because the Anglo-Norman nobility take over. The most of the actual people in the country haven't really changed, so that's something to bear in mind. But in terms of the leadership, there were some Anglo-Saxons who did manage to sort of make deals with the Normans and sort of stay in office. But generally speaking, William the Conqueror was quite keen to hand over most appealing estates and things to his cronies, because obviously he could trust them, and he was consolidating power, so I guess from his perspective he had to do that. Obviously it was not very popular amongst the Saxon elites, but it's very important to remember that the general public, the millions of people who lived and worked in their farms and villages, the peasantry, these guys are still the same people. They're still Anglo-Saxon people, really. They don't suddenly start
but them things didn't change. I mean, other than who was charging their taxes and
and they don't suddenly start speaking Anglo-Norman French, the general public. They're still speaking Old English, and then it gradually progresses, of course, to Middle English. But the elites are speaking Anglo-Norman French, which is a dialect of Old French. Different. And they also, obviously, of course, recorded most proceedings of a governmental nature in Latin. To be fair, the Anglo-Saxons were also using Latin, but they also tended to record things in Old English as well, I suppose. But the Normans definitely, they spoke in Old French, and they did record some things in that language, but they usually recorded in Latin. They didn't record anything in English, basically, particularly as far as I know.
English as a use of language in England didn't really take off until later, because the aristocracy, their language was French, correct, for the most part.
About the status of the language, certainly, obviously, before the Norman conquest, they were using it. I mean, Alfred the Great used to write in Old English, for example. And then, obviously, once the Norman conquest happened, the elite people, yes, they did prefer to use, either initially Anglo-Norman French, and then sort of more just standard sort of Old French. And then I think it was really Geoffrey Chaucer who, with his Canterbury Tales and Troilus and Cressida and so on. He was an astronomer as well, by the way. But he basically made it acceptable for English. It's Middle English at that time. He made that acceptable to be used as a language of elite discourse, of literature, and so on. And then you see people like Henry V writing things in English in the earlier 15th century. And obviously, by the time Richard III comes along, it's one of my favourite kings actually. During the Wars of the Roses, he was basically conducting pretty much everything in English. So
Yeah.
they accepted, yes. I mean, but the general public was still, for the whole time, hadn't changed. But we're just talking about the sort of the preferences of the elites. So yeah, it came back to English as the later Middle Ages sort of progressed, mainly because of people like Geoffrey Chaucer. I suppose Geoffrey Chaucer did for English what Dante did for Italian in many ways. Dante Alighieri. So that's an important point, I think. Yeah. Although I mean, they still did French was still considered for a long time, even in the later Middle Ages, to be a courtly language. So they're probably able to understand more than one language. Basically, they can understand a bit of Latin, some English, obviously, and some old French still. But it varied as time went by. They were using more English. The aristocrats certainly, but yeah. So we think of the medieval people or medieval elites in England as being definitely more bi or trilingual even. I mean, Richard the Lionheart, for example, his mother tongue was Old Occitan, which is actually different to Anglo-Norman French. So it's another type of very archaic French, which they spoke in southern France, which his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would have taught him. So he probably only knew a little bit of English. He would have understood some Latin because he had a good education. But Old Occitan, I think, was his mother tongue, as was King John. But John, of course, spent a lot more time in England than Richard, so he probably picked up more English because he would have had to have interacted with people a bit more. But it's very interesting, isn't it?
Learning about the language. I mean, again, not being steeped in it, just being sort of a casual fan of English history, learning, the progression and the history of the language. Like I knew there was Old English, and in my mind, I just assumed you went from sort of the Old English and it slowly grew into an English that we would recognize over time. But for a long time, I didn't realize that we had all these other languages and why there was this French influence. And for the longest time, I was really confused about all the French in England, and until, you learn more, which is the best part about all this. Like, it's not one big singular tone that's happening during these time periods. There are all these changes that are happening.
Exactly.
And that's what I found really interesting about the Anarchy. And I was very lucky. Like I only chose this Anarchy time period because I just looked up when I got fascinated by this medieval monk. What time period was he in? And this is largely what he was writing about was the Anarchy. And the more I read about the Anarchy, first I just started recognizing it in other stuff. I was like, oh, I had watched this television show, and it's a King Stephen guy was in there. And it would talk about Matilda, and then later, of course, I recognized it in the Game of Thrones plots.
Okay, it's in there as well, is it? Okay, well,
House of Dragon is just that. It's just the Anarchy where the king wants to name his daughter as the heir, and everybody else is like a woman, But then the same steps happen too. Like at first they accept it, and this is what it's going to be, and then people change their minds and stuff.
I know R. Martin is he's very inspired by the Middle Ages. I think the Game of Thrones is largely based on the Wars of the Roses between houses of Lancaster and York. So it's interesting. I didn't know the House of the Dragon. I didn't know that was related to the Anarchy. That's interesting. I'll have to check that out. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parallels. I think I watched some YouTube special that was kind of drawing even some of the characters he was really drawing on. And it's just that time period in this particular story, like I just noticed how much it's given to other novels and whether it's games or stuff. So I was really lucky that this character I chose to write about existed during this really interesting time.
Yes.
One of the other things I hate about this time period is everybody is named Matilda and Henry. Matilda is especially difficult because the two Matildas in the story, one Matilda is married to King Stephen, and if I'm correct, right? or am I confusing this Matilda with a different one?
In the main Matilda during the Anarchy was essentially the daughter of Henry I. So she was
Yeah,
married to the Holy Roman Emperor, which is basically the German Emperor. This is nothing to do
yeah,
with such. Well, I think they might like to think they were, but they were. It's basically Germany slash Bohemia. And she was his wife. I think he then died, and so she then married the Count of Anjou. Anjou being obviously a region of France, and then Stephen was the nephew of Henry I. So his
yeah. And they were cousins or first or
was
second cousins?
oh no, he's his nephew. He's his nephew. So
Okay.
Stephen, nephew of Henry I. I think, yeah.
Oh no,
Yeah.
I meant Matilda. Matilda and Stephen are
Oh, so
related.
Stephen and Matilda, that's a good question. So if Stephen's a nephew, then Empress Matilda's I suppose they are sort of cousins then, aren't they? If someone might guess. But I mean, strictly speaking, Matilda's claim was stronger by blood. And in England, we didn't. There's a law they used to have in France called the Salic law, which meant that, which I think goes back to people like Clovis, of the Merovingian people, which basically says, it says a lot of things, but one of the things it says is that a woman can't be a ruler. But we didn't have that in England. So it's a little bit cheeky that she wasn't allowed to rule, really, because legally speaking, she should have been allowed to.
Yeah.
Stephen just managed, he was from Blois, which is also in France. He managed to basically get a lot of support from magnates and therefore sort of make his own claim and take the throne. So it is, sort of
So let's
yeah.
give just a very short cap of how the anarchy started for people.
Okay.
I find it. I'm a little bit of a
Sure.
12-year-old when it comes to this, because the plot sort of turns around on one character getting diarrhea, like there, and every time I'm reading like a really heady book about this, the white ship is about to take off.
Yes.
So basically the whole story, like if this guy didn't get sick, none of this would have happened, or at least, yeah.
So the white ship disaster happened in 1120, and then that was when Henry I's son, William Adelin, drowned. So I think they were all they weren't far off the French coast. They were all drunk,
Yeah.
or a lot of them were, and they weren't necessarily the best swimmers either in those days, ironically, despite the fact they're sailing around. And so I haven't heard this story about diarrhea or anything, but
so what it was
ship struck some rocks or something not far off the coast, and then it started to get, and it went down obviously, and then Henry's legitimate heir basically died, and that's why he then said, "Oh, actually, now my heir is Matilda."
Yeah.
Maud, her name was.
So from what I remember, and I could be wrong, but I've read it enough times and I've laughed about it. So Stephen was supposed to be on the ship. Stephen was going
in Stephen of Blois. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't read that, but okay, fair enough. If you've seen that somewhere, it's interesting.
At least in one of the things that I'm reading, which okay. The other thing I'm learning about history too is accuracy has to be checked.
Of course.
Because a lot of people, if they're writing not from source material, if they're writing from books, once something is misprinted or printed in the wrong way, then other people just take it as facts, which we all run into any kind of research that we do.
It's very important to check the original primary sources, which is what you're referring to, as well as the obviously secondary literature, which we use for context more. But the original primary sources, yes, absolutely. And they need to be cross-referenced with other primary sources as well, because sometimes medieval chroniclers have a habit. One of the worst things they do is they exaggerate numbers. So the numbers of people fighting in a battle, or the numbers of people dying in a battle or something. But I mean, obviously it's still relevant and we should still read it and think about it, but just bear in mind, sometimes they do that, and it's sometimes helpful to compare. Well, it's always helpful to compare really different sources and try and work out which ones are more robust. So for example, William of Newbury or Newburgh, I think he has a generally quite a good reputation as a historian. And so for example, someone like Geoffrey of Monmouth, he's usually considered to be more of a fantasist. He's earlier. There is definitely a distinction between bona fide medieval chroniclers / historians and those who are a little bit more fanciful.
Sure.
Yeah. And incidentally, I know you mentioned some of the stories that William writes about, but I believe he sort of presents those as fables and as stories. So he doesn't present sort of these ghost stories as actual history, as far as I know. It's more of a sort of storytelling, basically.
This story was told over in this town of Berwick that this thing had happened, and it's that sort of thing.
Yeah. But in terms of actual events that happen, I mean, because you asked me to think about what did he write about. I mean, you mentioned he talks about the Anarchy. He also talks about Thomas Becket's murder. He talks about there were some quite a few attacks on Jewish people in the later 12th century, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So he talks about these things, and he's usually relatively unbiased when he's talking about them, and sort of sympathetic to those involved. So yeah, he's a pretty good historian, I think.
Yeah, I suspect that's why he's a good historian, because often, when I'm reading or doing the research, the author will say, about the opinions of a personality. Like, personalities will come through history sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, like all the different things I've read about the struggles between King Stephen and Matilda. You can tell who the author is sort of favoring, right? And at first, like I'm still kind of the team Matilda, right?
Okay, yeah. Well, she's more legitimate, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was how it started and stuff. And a lot of authors would write Stephen as just this dude who was just, trying to just kind of, they didn't always paint him in this really bright way. But then I'll find other authors where specifically it sounds like he just wasn't a good ruler. Like he seemed to have a good relationship with average people in a way, or at least his men and soldiers in a ways that the rest of the aristocracy wasn't. So it seems like he would have been just a good general, a good leader of like, he was great in battle, but he just wasn't a very smart ruler, And in fact, I mean, I think he had taken both Matilda and Stephen had been captured several times, or once or twice, and kind of got out of it, And actually, if you do end up doing research on game or a House of Dragon, I think the first king in there is very much like Stephen, where he wasn't fit to rule. Like, he didn't have a mind for ruling, but he was good with people, and he was good with battle. But like, when it comes to actually doing the stuff that you need to do to rule a kingdom, it seems to be a whole other set of skills.
Well, I mean, he certainly had support from a fair few of the barony, as did Matilda. I mean, they sort of had, at some points, sort of approaching equal support for each one, I think, which made things difficult. But as I was mentioning earlier, I think the barons did have a vested interest in dragging this out, because they wanted they liked the fact that the monarch wasn't having so much control over them, and it sort of led to almost like a decentralization of power. So that some barons, for example, started minting their own coinage. So they quite like this more decentralized approach. In fact, in Capetian France, the way it was run there was obviously the King of France, but then all of his magnates, it was generally more decentralized on the continent in terms of power. And then, of course, in England, the Anglo-Normans didn't follow that approach. It was highly centralized. And as I say, the Doomsday Book is a very good justification for that statement. That they had absolute knowledge and control over everything, and the barony didn't like that, and they wanted to move away from that, and they quite liked this war that went on for 19 odd years. Because at times I don't think the fighting wasn't always super intense the whole time either.
No, like in front of reading, there's only a handful of really large battles, but there was just a lot of skirmishes. From what I could tell, I could be wrong, but.
I mean, there was the Battle of Lincoln in 1141 when Stephen was captured. That was the year that Matilda was sort of the uncrowned. Well, she was uncrowned Lady of the English, she was called, which is a particularly interesting year. But that was a pretty big battle, and I think there was a siege in Oxford in 1142 and in Wallingford in 1153. So there were some set pieces, but absolutely yes, there weren't, much like the 100 Years' War, a bit of the later Middle Ages. They weren't fighting for the whole time, all 19 years.
Yeah. It was long and dragged out, because like even it was interesting that like she didn't get to where her father wanted her to be, or what her aspirations was to be the queen, but she lived long enough that she could see where her son could go.
Yes.
And that was interesting as well. It's a very long, drawn out struggle where both sides have had chances to just end it, like through killing or through keeping somebody else as a prisoner. And it's it's really interesting because when you're reading these things, it's like one of the sieges ended just with pity because the people who were being I'm sorry, my recall is so bad. I don't remember which particular instance this was, but like basically everybody was just starving to death inside and they had no water anymore. And
thinking of at the end, there was a siege of Wallingford when they sort of gave up, perhaps, and then they had the treaty in that same year, which sort of basically said that Stephen would be succeeded by Matilda's son, who's Henry. I think he was originally called Henry Fitz-Empress, and then he son of the Empress, but then he obviously is Henry II. I think his nickname was Kurt Mantle because of his short cloak or something as a fashion he had. But anyway, he was the first Angevin king because obviously his father was the Count of Anjou. So in 1154, that then begins the so-called Angevin Empire, because you had these, and he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, of course. So he brought to England, he brought Anjou and Normandy because his father had conquered Normandy, and Eleanor brought Aquitaine. So Henry II oversaw very large territorial possessions in continental France, which is one of the things, along with the Norman conquest, of course, which sort of set the stage for the later 100 Years' War in some ways. That blurring of where England begins and where France ends, because of course at that time they weren't really interested in England or France. They were interested in what is Angevin, what is Plantagenet, what is Capetian, what is Valois territory. And later on, as the Middle Ages sort of come to a close, they start to get sort of this national identity starts to become more of a thing. But I don't think during the Anarchy that's not the case, because Stephen was born in Blois. He became king of England, but he's not.
They were from everywhere
not
but
really
England.
more loyal to England or Blois, to be honest. So they're blurring there, and it's more of the family and the dynasty that they're loyal to, rather than any nationalistic sort of idea. Which maybe people find difficult to understand now, but that's how they were.
That was one of the things that was just really interesting in learning this history was just the way people thought of institutions differently, the way they thought of nationalism differently, what they were prideful in, what they would fight for, slightly not all the stuff that we think of. Because I think most of the stuff that we get about medieval time period especially is the later time period, where it's a little bit more relatable, which for me on a personal level I find less interesting. Like the closer we get towards the end, the history is interesting, but like as soon as guns show up, gunpowder, like I start to feel like, oh, that's the end. Whatever that this intangible thing about the medieval time period in Europe is. As soon as guns show up, I start to go, it feels like it's the end of the party.
I know what I'm saying, but to be fair, and right until the end of the Middle Ages, I mean, in the later Middle Ages, they did have cannon and they did have matchlock rifles, but they were used alongside the traditional medieval weapons that you would think of, longbows and lances and axes and crossbows. So they used them. They used them all together. So I think in the Wars of the Roses, for example, they did have cannon and they did have matchlock rifles, but they're still doing cavalry charges and fighting in single combat with swords. So I think it's definitely that's still very much medieval warfare. I think there were a series of wars called the Italian Wars in the first half of the 16th century, sort of 1500 to 1550. And those wars, which involved the Holy Roman Empire and I think Charles V, wasn't it? They basically really saw a skyrocketing in sort of these sort of small arms and cannon technology. So that after 1550, the medieval warfare as it had previously been known was sort of dying out. This is one of the reasons
Yeah.
why in about 1610, when Don Quixote was written by Cervantes, Don Quixote is sort of he's about 1600, 1610. He's sort of longing to be a medieval knight,
For
but
this
he's
other time period, yeah.
10 years too late or so, 120 years too late, and he's sort of seen as this sort of slightly unusual fellow who sort of wants to be something that he's, that's long gone, sort of thing. But I think
Yeah.
so after about 1550, certainly by the later 16th century, the sort of the image of the sort of standard medieval knight is sort of not really such a thing. But certainly up until 1500, I don't think there's any issue there, because they were using these things alongside each other. Admittedly, it did make a difference to siege warfare, even in the later Middle Ages. You don't see as many castle sieges, for example, during the Wars of the Roses as you did, say, during the Barons' Wars of the 13th century, with King John in the First Barons' War, Henry III, Simon de Montfort, etc., Edward I in the Second Barons' War. He was actually the Lord Edward in the Second Barons' War. So there is definitely a change, but nonetheless, I do think warfare is still definitely recognisable as medieval up until, definitely in England up until 50.
It's only recently that I grew appreciation for some appreciation for I think it's just called the correct me if I'm wrong, the medieval modern period. Is that what it's called?
The early modern period. Yeah, the early modern period follows the Middle Ages. So and it's, people always argue about dating. I mean, I think a lot of historians of medieval England would say that the English Middle Ages end with the dissolution of the monasteries in about 1539-ish. Because that was a huge change for the country. So you might count it up until that point, perhaps at the absolute latest. Certainly anything after that is early modern. Some people might say anything after about not long after 1500 is early modern, I suppose. But I think increasingly medievalists will work up till the Reformation for England. Of course, in different parts of the world, for the Byzantine Empire, for example, ended in 1453 proper in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, the medieval Roman Empire, was also known as these days the Byzantine Empire, to help sort of distinguish it from the ancient Roman Empire. So their empire ended in 1453. There were some successor states, such as the Despotate of Epirus and the Empire of Trebizond, which continued a few decades later, but they're sort of ending in about 1470s. So you might say, a historian of Byzantium might say that that's when they think the Middle Ages end. I mean, there's always people arguing about when did the Middle Ages end, when did the Middle Ages begin. It's an interesting question. Depends to some extent on your criteria. Well, completely it depends on your criteria, and to some extent on your sort of preferences.
Because where you're talking about like governmental, societal, or just the way they look, even because dress changes, you could see the fashion stuff kind of happen pretty quickly. Well, to us it seems pretty quickly, but you're talking probably a period of 100 years where things are vacillating back and forth.
Certainly for England, the later Tudor fashion is definitely very different to, say, earlier. If you look at Henry VII, for example, he does look pretty medieval. If you look at some fop from about 1590, you might not be something. So they didn't go in for, I mean, obviously as time progressed, they started getting these big collars, didn't they? And start looking a bit, it doesn't look very practical, and that's sort of definitely not a medieval sort of style. And then
some of that, I read that. I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Later on, of course, as time progressed in the 17th century, they started wearing wigs.
That's definitely the end of the medieval period.
Not really. It's too impractical for the medieval mindset, I would have thought, really. But
So what do you think it is? So you've been running your Facebook page now for you said 2016, so it's a little over 10 years, but getting there. What do you think it is about this time period, especially England, France, and Germany, that seems like, what do you recognize from people who contribute to your website, to your Facebook page? And I encourage anybody who's watching this is kind of interested to go check it out. It's great. What do you find are the commonalities there that draw people to it?
Well, I think I've made a list of a few things. I think you've already sort of touched upon the links to sort of the mythological and the fantasy world, which I think, although, that's sort of that's something we like now, but I think it's an important thing. It's something that matters to people. People like Lord of the Rings, they like Game of Thrones. They like King Arthur. They like Robin Hood. There's a character in Byzantium called Diogenes Akritas, who's sort of a hero on the borderlands between Byzantium and the Islamic world. So there's all these sort of mythological figures who people still love to hear stories about now, and as children they may well have heard these stories. So there's something which I certainly did. So it's
That's
something
where I
that
began.
appeals to people. It sort of gets to your heart, I suppose, doesn't it, in some ways? But then more than that, I do think personally, I mean, I'm biased because I spend a lot of my time doing this, but I do think that the medieval era was particularly dynamic, and it was a time of significant change. I mean, it's 1,000 years, we're talking about a millennium. There's a lot of variation during that time. You do see the emergence of nation states and countries towards the end. You're having these crazy events happen, like the Crusades, these massive events that sort of involve huge numbers of people, massive amounts of land. You've got the coming together of, or clashing, or either working together or fighting with each other, these different civilizations, the Christian world, the Islamic world. And within the Christian world, of course, you've got the Latins and the Greek Christians also having their struggles. So you've got these very large events happening, which I think appeals to people. I think the Crusades do appeal to people a lot as well.
Scale, yeah.
These days, people can get a little bit... some people try to make them a bit politically loaded for the modern age, which I personally wouldn't do. I would sort of keep them in their medieval context. There may be perhaps some things we can draw out for the modern times, but I wouldn't do that too much, because it's you've got to look at them as for what they were, sort of medieval holy warfare, crusade and jihad. But yeah, so I do think that certainly gets a lot of people's attention. I also think there's a lot, we live in the world we live in now is it's very almost excessively integrated in some ways. And we're very dependent on technology, and the things we're doing, and you're burning all these greenhouse gases and things doesn't help the environment at all, does it? And where the medieval people were completely pre-industrial, and their impact on the environment was much more.
That's interesting, because when I think about when I start to lose interest in the certain time periods, like there's the gun thing, but also the discovery of well, not the discovery of America, but
the rediscovery,
the rediscovery of America, because it reminds me of capitalism and all the trappings that we're in now, like everything that you can kind of escape to in your mind, even with all the horrible toughness that was happening during that medieval period. I think there is a certain level of escapism that's there, whether it's the true history or the fringe sort of fantasy stuff, And
I also think village life, although if you were a peasant and if you were a serf, things were difficult, although there are scholars who sort of argue it wasn't as bad as has previously been thought, but it was nonetheless not a walk, it's not a picnic. But it was very family and community oriented, which I think is something that perhaps we in the modern world have lost some of, certainly in the Western world. And that is something that was absolutely for them, their community and their family was absolutely fundamental to their lives, which is something that's very appealing, I think, to people. And on top of that, I would say that the art and architecture that comes out of the period is extremely impressive. And there's a lot of, contrary to sort of some 19th century historians, the amount of sort of science and technology and mathematics that comes out of the medieval period, whether it's the Latin world, the Greek world, or the Islamic world, or even further east, the sort of in the sort of the
there's a tendency
world,
to erase a lot of that that history.
There's a huge amount of discovery going on, and the founding of very important sort of techniques in the sciences, and a great amount of work in things like geometry and algebra, and even the foundations of things like calculus. So this is very interesting and fundamental to the development of human civilization. So I think this is one of the reasons why people are so interested, certainly why I'm so interested.
And they were, it's definitely like, I love the whole pushback against even the term Dark Ages.
Oh dear,
because it paints this weird picture, and like we were all taught in school, at least in the States, that they all thought that the Earth was flat, but no, you just look at the paintings. There's God holding a globe. Why is he holding a globe if you think that the world is flat?
Yes, I mean, there are these misconceptions. I mean, I don't think medieval people thought the world was flat. I know there are some people today though that do think the world is flat. Uh, the other thing is, some medieval people did know that it wasn't a widespread belief, but there were certainly some figures during the Middle Ages who did think that they did believe that the Earth went round the sun rather than the sun going round the Earth. So obviously the widely held belief was that the Earth was at the centre, but there were some individuals who definitely were not thinking that. Hypatia of Alexandria, the very early Middle Ages, for example, she was a Byzantine person. She definitely, following on from the works of someone called Aristarchus from antiquity, she definitely did think that the Earth was not at the centre. And there were people who did hold that view, although it wasn't necessarily a widely held view. There was that view there amongst some individuals. So yeah, there's definitely a lot there that was known, and we're still finding out really the things, the extent that they did know. And for example, there's an Anglo-Saxon book called Ball's Leech Book, which contains this little sort of set of ingredients for an eye ointment. And it turns out that eye ointment, which has been published in sort of recent microbiology journals, does actually kill MRSA, which is a sort of a resistant resistant sort of a bacteria resistant to antibiotics. So this little Anglo-Saxon remedy does actually treat that. So that's pretty impressive. And there have been things found outside the walls of Constantinople. They found things like digoxin in little vials, which is used to control heart rate and things like atrial fibrillation. They wouldn't have necessarily known it was atrial fibrillation, but they obviously recognized if someone had a high heart rate, perhaps we can use digoxin, which comes from foxgloves, to lower their heart rate. So, there's medical things there as well, which are pretty impressive. And in fact, even in Constantinople, they did actually try to separate some conjoined twins surgically, which they did manage to do successfully. I think this was in the 11th century. They did actually manage to do it. Unfortunately, basically what happened was one of the twins died and that one of them was still alive. They were then separated surgically. The one that hadn't died was sort of lived for a little while, I think a few days, but unfortunately they did succumb to an infection. But the point is, they did actually anatomically do the operation correctly. The only thing was they needed some stronger antibiotics probably in that particular case. But it's still pretty impressive for them to have executed that procedure.
Sure.
So there's an awful lot going on, and the amount of writing that survives from that time. I do mainly think about the England and the Byzantium and so on, and the Holy Land. The amount of writing that survives from that time is vast. The term Dark Ages used to be used to refer to the earlier Middle Ages, but even then, there's plenty of material, depending on where you are in the world as well. There's plenty of material coming through. I mean, there's something to be said that the immediate centuries after the withdrawal of the Western Roman Empire from England,
That's why I used to think that it was in reference to there was a period we just didn't know a lot about. And then I guess it became pejorative at some point where it's like, they were just dirty and ugly and stupid.
So the ancient Romans started to withdraw from England in about 380, and they completed that process militarily and politically in 410. But of course, it's not true to say that the Roman way of life immediately suddenly ended in 410 just because there's no soldiers around. I mean, that people still continue to lead sort of a British way of life. In fact, there have been mosaics found which date from after that time. So they're still sort of continuing a sort of a Roman type of life. I'm
smiling because one of the things that led me into history early on was a television series called Time Team.
Tony Robbins.
I absolutely loved, and this was something I learned from watching that show. They'll uncover like a village from that time period and talking about how it was still Romanesque. Like it's not like it was shut down, like lights went off, togas off, you were still living a Roman life for 100 years or so or longer until things slowly pan out. It didn't just happen immediately, and it's fascinating.
I mean, admittedly, there are fewer sources which cover those earlier years, the immediate post-Roman years. I mean, you do have St. Patrick actually wrote at that time. and a chronicler called Gildas did. And of course, you have aspects of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which basically also cover that time period. But essentially, so there are written sources there, and we can use those in conjunction with archaeological sources as well to get a better understanding of that time period, essentially. And that is obviously that is very important. This interplay between historical documents and archaeological data. But it's certainly the case, although, as I say, although the sources are a bit thinner on the ground, they definitely are still there. And there are also slightly later sources which do refer to that time period as well. For example, Nennius, who's writing a bit later, he also writes about that time period. So yeah, there's certainly sources that can be used. And in terms of, as you were mentioning, in terms of the way of life, these people are still continuing with this Roman way of life, and they're still preserving the technology. I mean, they still had baths, for example, for a while, Roman baths. Not for a huge amount of time, but they're still using them, and they're still building mosaics, and they're still building villas. So, or sort of the Roman British version of a villa. So, yeah, they've not suddenly, forgotten how to do everything just because the Middle Ages has begun or something. I mean,
yeah.
Funny way of, people used to say this sort of thing, I think, in a long time ago, but yeah. I'm hopeful that this sort of mindset has been is gradually sort of dying out. I mean, you see popular books like the Light Ages, for example, being published, which is a particularly important sort of thing. I think, popular media sort of promoting these sorts of ideas as well. So that's
I hope we get more of it, because the more I learned, the more I learned how much we're kind of learning about the same thing over and over again. The same stories that we keep telling ourselves, like, what we're talking about, the science thing. There's much more representation of women in history, but you just have to kind of look harder. And it's there, but we keep focusing on the same stories. And every time I listen to like a podcast or I read a new book, and it's like pretty amazing, and that stuff needs to get more attention, not just for the obvious reasons, but because why are we telling the same stories all the time? Another thing I'm learning more about is sort of the Slavic and more Eastern side of Europe, which, so I don't know, do you play video games? Are you playing this?
At the moment, I'm a little bit busy with things, but I do play the odd game. But yeah, at the moment, I'm not really playing anything too much. But historically, I have the odd game. I like games. I like very lengthy sort of role-playing games. Like
then you will want to find time for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, not the first one.
Okay,
and it takes place in Prague and Hungary and Bohemia, and they get into that history. And I saw videos of people from those countries just kind of not quite crying, but almost like we don't get that represent. Like even in Europe, they're like, it's all England and France kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room. And there's so much more to learn about these time periods, about the people and the personalities, learning about monasteries and how monasteries ran, and finding out all kinds of stuff there that, like, again, they just kind of tell the same stories over and over again. So hopefully, whether it's fantasy or historians being able to make a bigger impact here on Facebook and such, and popular culture, we'll start to hear those other stories. Whether they're about specific parts of society, specific people, or just the fact, like, when everybody thinks about the Crusades, they think about, going to Jerusalem. But we had this whole, the Crusades in Europe were fighting against the pagans, which I find deeply fascinating. And I can hardly find, there's only that much information on it. And that stuff, especially.
I mean, the trading world was far more than just the high medieval crusades to the Holy Land. I mean, that was obviously a central part that people always remember in the general public. But there were later crusades to the Holy Land. Then there were crusades elsewhere around the Mediterranean. There's a Reconquista in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. There's, as you were mentioning, crusades against the Baltic pagans. There were crusades within Latin Christendom itself. There were crusades against Byzantium. There were crusades in support of Byzantium into the Balkans. So
crusades against other Christians in Europe. Like
Yeah,
was,
so
was the Cathars, and
one of
there was
the
another
I've,
group.
I've worked on is Dispenser's Crusade, which was a crusade between the English supporters of the Roman Pope and the French supporters of the Avignonese Pope. And the Roman Pope declared that the Avignonese Pope was basically the anti-Pope, and then there was a crusade launched against the supporters of the anti-pope. Of course, to the French, he was the true pope, or I should say to the Capetians, he was a true pope, or the Valois. But yes, so there is fighting within Latin Christendom itself during the Crusades, and of course the Crusades against the Albigensians in the south of France. That occurred. That was Latin Christian against Latin Christian. So that's another dimension as well, because they were persecuted very severely. Actually, the Albigensians. It's a particularly nasty affair. And this was they were considered to be heretics, but obviously they would have considered themselves to be Latin Christians. And then, of course, there was the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople. That was when the Venetians attacked the Byzantium. Although there was some, it was a bit more complicated than that. But ultimately, they did sack Constantinople as a result of They got involved in sort of this plot to sort of try and reinstate a Byzantine emperor, and then the reinstated Byzantine emperor ended up not paying them. Because he got murdered, I think.
I want to wrap this up, and I'll hit you with a couple more questions, though.
Sure.
One, like with the Byzantium Empire, why do you think that history seems to be so impenetrable? And I don't mean difficult to read, but like when you ask people about the medieval time period, again, like Byzantium's kind of thing people that seem to have heard about. It's like, oh, it's the leftover part of Rome, and it lasted for a short period of time. But like, why does it not get the sort of attention that, say, the rest of the medieval time period does in the European circles and stuff?
So, did you say it lasted? The Byzantine Empire lasted for a very long time. We usually go from 330 AD to 1453, but then, as I mentioned, Epirus and Trebizond were a bit later. I think Epirus ended in about 1479. Trebizond was also in the 1470s, I think. It was 1461. Sorry, Trebizond.
Yeah, but do you find what I'm saying true, or maybe it's just my own perception that the general public just doesn't seem to pay much attention?
Yeah.
There's no films really during the Byzantium time periods, or
this is another concern of mine. I have another group called Byzantine Empire, Crusades and Caliphates in the Medieval World, which does try to bring the history of Byzantium to the wider public. But I think probably, I hope now, as we're sort of in the 21st century, there's more of an understanding and awareness of the Byzantine or medieval Roman Empire. But I think there was a sort of a movement over the last few centuries, certainly in the West, to sort of distance themselves a little bit in terms of when they're studying ancient Rome from the medieval Romans. So these historians do think that once Rome fell and the capital moved to Constantinople, they sort of weren't so interested, and I think that one of the reasons is because they felt that the Pope was really sort of, in some ways, and the Holy Roman Emperor were sort of taking in some ways from that Roman power in the West, and so it confuses things if you then start saying, oh, actually, there's actually the Roman Empire carries on throughout this whole time in the East. So all the time you've got the Roman Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor in the West saying, oh, I'm a legitimate successor, sort of thing. You've got the Byzantine Emperor sitting on the throne in Constantinople, who sort of is a bit of probably in their eyes a slap in the face to that, although they were there. The Byzantines obviously were there first. So I think there perhaps was a movement within certain circles of historians and perhaps the church are in sort of the more early modern period to try to sort of downplay the significance of the Byzantine Empire.
That's so strange too. It's like this kind of weird historical bias, to want to like. It's very odd, because it's not a threat
No,
You know,
no,
so
it's a
it's such
sort
a
of a
odd thing, but you see it all the time.
I suspect in their mind it's a sort of a threat to the legitimacy of their own empire or their own sort of status. But I don't think we have that situation now, and I think there's certainly a lot of people who are very much interested in raising awareness of the history of Byzantium, and of course the main language after Heraclius was well, the spoken language in Constantinople was always Greek, really, and the written language became Greek formally after Heraclius in sort of the 7th century. So it may be that people find Greek a little bit more impenetrable. I don't know, than Latin, although they both have their difficulties, I suppose. But that might be another thing.
Yeah.
But I think this is sort of. I do think there's definitely more awareness of the medieval Roman Empire now than there was, say, 20, 30, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't think people are biased really so much in the academic. Well, I wouldn't. Academics are certainly not biased. In fact, if anything, they're very interested in increasing our understanding of this civilization and these people. But yeah, I take your point. I think it is certainly something that was neglected. I think perhaps if you think of Edward Gibbon, his decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he usually is a bit quite scathing of the Byzantines. And that perhaps he was writing in sort of 1780s or 90s, I think, and it may be that sort of mindset sort of could have break forward a little bit into
yeah, and I think for the general
yeah
for the general unwashed masses such as myself, it's kind of like you hear the phrase "the fall of the Roman Empire," so
yeah
you just kind of assume it just ended. And like I remember being shocked, like, oh, the Byzantines still consider themselves Roman, a part of the Roman Empire anyway. Like they didn't
yeah
see it
well,
change. It wasn't like, there was this date that happened again, just like in England, the date that happens and everything changes. That's just how we are perceiving the history.
that carried on in the West. I don't even think you can talk about the Western Roman Empire falling in the traditional sense of the word. I think there was a gradual economic decline, probably in fact exacerbated by the wars with the Goths that Justinian and Belisarius engaged in the 6th century even. And that sort of did cause huge sort of damage to the infrastructure of the peninsula. So again, that's not a sudden thing either. That's sort of a gradual thing. It may be that western part sort of declined more actually a bit later on as a result of those wars. But yeah, so it's always interesting debating about dates and things, and it is be something, an exercise that can get historians warmed up sometimes, I suppose. But yeah, it's certainly interesting, and it's important to bear in mind these sorts of I suppose historiographical questions when sort of embarking on your own projects and things, your own work. Yeah.
I mean that's definitely a fear of like as I look back on William of Newbury, there are certain things that I leaned into that I'm like,
yeah,
I find that creatively I leaned into it, but like I wish I had made some space in sort of my forward or afterward to talk about it a little bit, but these are things that I can do in the future because I plan on working more in this time period. And not only there will be more William of Newbury, so I'll be bugging you more about those questions in the future.
Oh yes, please. Me things. Fine. You've got my email address.
I can keep talking to you forever, man. You mentioned the Greek stuff. I'm huge into learning about that. I'm also fascinated of how, again, like the Roman Empire, when Greece sort of fell to Rome, in my mind for the longest time, like that culture was gone, but it wasn't. It kept going. Like just because they didn't run their own armies and governments and stuff, the Greek culture was still there. And so just learning, every time I learn more about history, there's all these sort of like these onions get peeled back. And I'm hoping that we can get other people excited, whether it's through fiction or coming to your page.
That for the elite Constantinopolitans, their culture really was primarily Greek. So they spoke Greek and they wrote in Greek, medieval Greek, of course. They spoke Byzantine medieval Greek and they wrote in Byzantine medieval Greek. And they were very much linked to their Hellenic past and the ancient Greek philosophers, and they studied those. And to be an elite statesman in, say, 11th century Byzantium or 11th century Constantinople, you'd be expected to know Plato and so on and so on, Socrates and so on, and Aristotle and so on and so forth. So they would have expected Homer, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Reciting these sorts of things was important to them, indeed, even some of the a lot of the elite scholars of Byzantium used to write in a classicizing style. So their Greek, they actually use sort of features and little features of the language, like rough and smooth breathings and things, which are actually antiquated, which they didn't really need to use in the Middle Ages, but they use them specifically to sort of draw attention to the fact that they've got this link really to their classical past. So they're much it's a continuum for them, and they were the ones who were living it. So it is a continuum basically. Definitely, and that's fascinating.
And this is a good point that history has history. When this time period you're talking about, they were looking back at the Greeks. The Greeks themselves looked back at the earlier Bronze Age Greeks, or pre-Greeks, and they weren't Greeks. So, and it's just fascinating to think. Like, all right, I'll stop talking. I'm going to keep going. But I just want to thank you for your time.
You're very welcome
for putting up with my questions, and I hope we can do this again at some point in the future. I have another project that's dipping into history, and we can get you back. And in the meantime, links are below for your Facebook page. Is there anything that you want to tell people about, or either plug or just encourage people to check out?
Absolutely. So thanks for watching, everybody. There is so the groups are Medieval England, and then Byzantine Empire, Crusades and Caliphates in the medieval world, and you're more than welcome to join in. Obviously, people from all backgrounds are welcome. You don't have to be a specialist in a very fine area. You can just be.
It's not a snobby page.
No, not at all. I mean, there are people there who are very professionally sort of educated in the subject, but it doesn't have to be. It's not purely for that. It's not for that purpose, really. It's for all people to sort of engage in all aspects of the Middle Ages across those groups. So,
not only you, but like I've just asked on the page questions, and people would just send me articles and stuff, and it's just that kind of group.
Very friendly.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for hanging out. I really, really appreciate it, man.
And thank you very much for sending me your wonderful little and signing it for me. Much
Absolutely, man. Well, I'm a fan of yours, and I look forward to meeting you someday when we come out there. It's been a little while since I've been to the UK, but it'll happen.
Too far, really. Modern technology.
All right, anytime. I'll see you in the next stream. I'll see you on your Facebook page.
You take care of that.
Thank you so much.
Bye.